Better get on. Thanks very much, Mark. Next on the list is Melli. Melli's sort of our finale this afternoon. I've already done some introducing of her and her hobbies, but basically, she's got over 20 years of experience doing this type of thing. She loves to work with developers so that she sees real life and ways to enhance the product. And she's obviously one of my favorites. It's good to present with you today, Melli. And now I'll hand over to you, and you've got yourself just over 20 minutes to
Hmm.
make it shine.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. So I think, oh yeah, we thought it would be interesting for some members of the community to see what are the new features that have been added to Oracle Graph, both on the property graph side and the RDF graph side. So what I did was I went back around maybe 6 months or so from the last Graph TechCast day approximately to look at what new features we have added since then and kind of pick the ones that are probably of interest to the audience. So while talking about new features, I was thinking I should also set the make it very clear where what our deployment options are because the release cycles are different depending on the deployment option, and there have been some questions around that. So let me just summarize that we have Graph Studio in Autonomous Database. We've talked extensively about that. And we also have the Graph Server and Client offering that works with any database 12.2 or later that can be provisioned in Oracle Cloud, which we would call as the co-managed option or user-managed on-premise. So you have three options for deploying any of the Oracle Graph features, and they all have they're bit different release cycles. So Graph Studio is updated monthly, like many of our other managed cloud offerings. And Graph Server and Client is released about once every 3 months. So we have four releases in a year. And I want to emphasize once again that it works with Oracle Database 12.2 or later and works with any database edition. So the new features that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about what happened in the last few releases, last couple of releases of Graph Server and Client. And again, they work with any database 12.2 or later. And just to kind of round out our release cycle descriptions here, RDF Graph has the RDF server is actually released with RDF with Graph Server and Client, so that's every 3 months. And a lot of the core RDF features are part of Oracle database releases, and that goes with the Oracle database release cycle. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but I just really want to make people aware that we do release very frequently, excuse me. So in any deployment, we have the ability to create a graph, query a graph, analyze a graph, and visualize a graph. And Mark was kind of showing that as the core uh, steps when you're working with graphs. What varies is the degree of automation and the tools available. So when I'm talking about new features, some of them will be the core features, like is there a different way to create a graph and so on. And some of it will be around tools available, like what are the new interpreters that we have available with our offerings. And I'll try to highlight that as we go along. So recent new features, property graph views. If you had noticed this, that Mark, if you had actually noticed happened to see that in Mark's slide, I think he was clearly using property graph views. But let me highlight a little bit of that. So so there's a short snippets of the demo I will show. I'm going to use a graph example like this that is created from three tables. You have a customer table, you have a movie table, and you have a cost sales table, which has information on which customer rented which movie. So every row in the customer table is a vertex. Every row in the movie table is a vertex, and the cost sales table connects the two tables. So Jim and Mark have talked extensively about this. I just wanted to show the data set that I'll be kind of using a little bit in the demos. So property graph view. So Jim focused heavily on analytics, and it was really great to see all his examples. And he was talking about how you load your graph into memory, create your graph, load your graph into memory, and then you run on all of these analytics on it, which is great for analytics use cases. Like Jim was talking about how you can detect fraud. Mark was talking about how you have all of this reporting information, you're pulling that into a graph and then working with it. We were seeing folks who want to do what we sometimes term as OLTP graph applications, where the graph is updated constantly. So you're not just taking a snapshot of your data and creating a graph. The graph is being updated constantly, and you want those updates instantly reflected in your graph. So we have the concept of property graph views. Again, Jim and Mark have talked about this, where you create a view, which is basically a set of metadata tables on data that you have in your in your database. So the data remains in tables, as we've discussed, and you create this property graph views. And then when you run the property graph queries on that graph represented in these metadata tables, it gets translated into something that runs in the database. And of course, folks will immediately say, oh, you're running in the database, and can you be really fast? And the answer to that is, though we're running in the database has many different sophisticated features for running different workloads, and it runs the graph workloads in the database extremely well. We have done some benchmarking with the interactive short benchmark, I believe, from the Linked Data Benchmark Council, and we plan to publish that in a bit. And the numbers look very good because the database does very well, and there are some optimizations built in for graph, and one of them is a new feature I want to talk about. So the nice thing about having the looking at the graph in the database is, of course, we talked a lot about Graph Studio, but I want to take a minute to talk about a couple of other tools, of like the SQL client. And before that, this is when in Graph Studio, when you're creating a graph, you would just select the PG view option to create a property graph view. And then, as I was saying, you can also use this from a SQL CL client. So it's a familiar tool, just like you work with SQL. You can enable PGQL mode, and then you can say, I'm going to run PGQL queries. So let me just quickly show what that looks like here. If I can get to move this window up. Give me a second here. Okay. So I know it's not a pretty screen like Graph Studio was, but I really wanted to show how folks can connect to SQL CL. So I'm connecting to a database here, and then I'm enabling PGQL auto on to get into PGQL mode. And I did that by installing the plugin. So there's a plugin installed with MySQL CL install. So when I enable this for PGQL, I can run PGQL queries, and I can also create a graph. So you can either create a graph in Graph Studio, as Jim and Mark have shown, or I can actually code a property graph, create property graph statement, and I can run it. So, and then we can also run many queries here. So the nice thing about the key point I want to make is that this is a graph in the database that you can use with many different database tools. You can use this programmatically. And going back to the slides here, let me come back to the slide in a second. You can use this in a Java or a Python application. You can use a PGQL connection object, or you can use a JDBC. You can execute PGQL queries via your JDBC driver. So it makes it really easy to embed your graph queries within your database application. And while working with the database, I'm just going to go back to this slide a bit. You can insert data using SQL because your original source data is in SQL. So when you insert your data into SQL, the changes are immediately reflected in your property graph view. Or you can choose to use PGQL to insert, update, and delete information in the graph. So this is a brand new feature. Ability to use PGQL on your property graph view is a recent feature. I shouldn't say brand new, it's a recent feature. So let me also go to another example here where it's really interesting to see how now you can start combining database functions with your property graph view. So here, for example, I'm using some JSON functions within a graph query. And these things make the property graph views very powerful because you can take any database function and use that in your graph view. So let me see whether I can show something here quickly. So I'm logging into Graph Studio here. And as I'm logging into Graph Studio, I'm going to kind of look at one of the property graph views here. So the graph type is property graph. So I have this view here, and this is a graph of type PG view. So I can select that and go to my query playground here. And then let me bring up my query screen here, my list of queries that I have. So I could run a query like this that is now going to use a database function in this query. And why this is interesting to have your properties stored and queried via JSON is that not all properties exist for this particular in this particular data set. So this is the movie table, and you have a crew column, and not all crew columns have information about all the same set of information. So when you use a JSON, when you represent the data as JSON, you can have some of the columns have producer information, some have director information, and so on. So you don't have to have all the information for all the rows in your table. You just have a JSON column that captures the information that some rows or some vertices in the graph have this information, and that makes it, and you can query that with JSON. So you can store a JSON data in your column in your database, and when you represent that as a graph, you can use the same JSON function within your graph query. So with that, let me go back to the session. So in this particular data set, this particular column is basically a varchar2 column storing a JSON data. Let's see whether I can quickly show that if I remember the login here. Yes, okay. So just to show you what I was showing here, this is my database actions. So if I can just run this query here, you can see here that this is JSON data that I was then querying from a graph query. So this is JSON data. So I'm using, this is in SQL, I'm just showing that you have JSON data, and then I'm using JSON functions here to query the property graph view. So all kinds of interesting things are possible. And we do support a comprehensive set of comprehensive PGQL syntax. Not some of the syntax capabilities is focused only is supported only in memory, but we do support a very good set here. And I wanted to highlight one key thing, that when your graph is a tree, we have a new implementation that makes queries that use the all keyword extremely fast, like about 100x, 2 orders of magnitude improvement. So when your graph is a tree, which we find actually occurs quite a lot, maybe it's a human resources direct graph, or maybe it's a set of assets, and people want to drill down their assets by looking at all the paths that are going in from one particular node or vertex in the graph, and they may be aggregating on some property that goes through all the assets. All of these are examples of graphs which are trees, and you can really very effectively work with them by this property graph view in the database. And so path analysis is basically the most common use case that's relevant here. When you want to do page rank and between the centrality and all the other algorithms that Jim was talking about, then you load your graph into memory and you run the algorithms. So when you're loading, there's always a question of how much memory do I need to load? And we have an estimator to estimate the amount of memory you need to load into the graph. But one of our very new features is that when you load your graph into memory, you can load just a subgraph. So if I'm just loading the complete graph, I would just say read graph by name, provide the name of the graph and load that into memory. Or I could load a subset. I can say I just want to load vertices of type customer of a certain age. I can load that subgraph into memory and run my graph analytics algorithms on this subgraph. And I can also expand the subgraph when needed. I can say, oh, I now want to load a few more vertices and a few more edges, and I can dynamically expand that subgraph. And we have lots of other PGQL syntax extensions that we've added, that we keep adding over our, let's say, quarterly release cycle and our monthly updates in Graph Studio. And when you also load the graph into memory, you can optimize it for read-only in memory or optimize it for updates if you're going to periodically synchronize with the graph that is in your database. So RDF graphs in Graph Studio, lots of exciting news to share on that front as well. I think Ramu showed earlier that we have a new Sparkle interpreter. And the key goal here, as he was highlighting, is to make it easy to get started with RDF graphs in minutes. And historically, that maybe has not been so straightforward. You have this additional component, you have to go install, etc. But now with Graph Studio and Autonomous Database, and also with RDF Server, as Ryota was showing, it's very easy to get started. And with Graph Studio in particular, there's no additional installation. You provision your database, your Graph Studio is available, and you can start working with RDF graphs. You can load your RDF files, and we're going to keep adding more on how you can create more RDF graphs. And also, as Ramu was showing, you can have one notebook to run property graph queries, to run Sparkle queries, and also to run SQL queries. You can do that all from your notebook. And I will finish up here with some RDF graph performance enhancements. So RDF graph, as I said, is more, the RDF server is in the graph server client release. So it releases 4 times a year. The core RDF features such as performance enhancements for queries running in the database, they go with the database release cycle, but the database also has quarterly release updates of patches. So we recently, I think in mid-April, made available a feature that enables a very significant performance boost. So we give users the ability to create some optional tables that enable you to run some queries very fast. So you can think of it like materialized views. They're not materialized views, but you can conceptually, they are like materialized views because you are storing some information in some additional structures that will be used during query. So especially for Sparkle queries, Sparkle is a query language for RDF graphs. For Sparkle queries with star patterns, property chains, you can get up to 10x and sometimes more improvement while running those queries. So we're very excited about this feature. We've used this in a couple of customer POCs to great advantage. So if you have RDF graph, I think there were some questions around what's the size of RDF graph that you can use. There's really no limit, and as you know from the Japan example that Ryota shared, we have scaled to billions of triples at like an average query response time of 1+ seconds, and now we have additional performance boosts that are that's possible. So we're very excited about this as well. And I think that brings me to the end of what I wanted to say, Roger.
Oh, thank you very much, Melli. As usual, in some ways, people like you and Philippe and crew, you have the best things because you get all the new stuff that you get to share. So, really.